This begins CD number 7.
The second is معرفة ذلة العبودية وكسرها. Understanding the humiliation of servanthood and its disempowering effect on you. You learn something about your Lord, but you also learn something about your own state. Al-ikhlasu lillah. Sincerity to Allah, because one of the few times that you will ever actually call on Allah in a sincere state is when everything is hopeless. And the only hope you have is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Abu Hanifa radiallahu anhu was once talking with a man who'd been in a shipwreck and he didn't believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he said, "What happened to you when you fell overboard?" He said, "I was in the midst of this massive ocean." And he said, "Did you think you were going to die?" He said, "No, I was hoping I would be saved." And he said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, I was hoping." And he said, "That thing you were hoping for is Allah." Because where did that come from? Just the hope, raja. The poet said, "Mali siwaka hidatun illa raja." I have no other means to you except hope. I mean, that Abu Nawas, who was a really wretched poet, and I don't want to make ghiba of a dead man, but I mean, he was a bad guy and wrote poetry that's so outrageous. I mean, he used to write poetry like, "Bring me the wine and don't bring it secretly, because what good is a sin done in secret?" I mean, he really had some. So he said the enjoyment is that you can just flaunt it. But he, on his deathbed, he has the last lines he ever wrote, which inshallah will redeem all that other stuff. But he just said, "Rabbi kathurat dhunubi, azumat dhunubi kathratan." My Lord, my wrongs have become so vast and so many. وَلَكِنِّي أَعْلَمُ أَنَّ عَفْوَكَ أَعْظَمُ. But I know that your forgiving nature is greater than any wrongs I could do. And then he says, إِذَا لَا يَرْجُوكَ إِلَّا الْمُحْسِنُ. If only people, Rabbi, إِذَا لَا يَرْجُوكَ إِلَّا مُحْسِنُ. If only good doers have hope for you. فَبِمَنْ يَسْتَجِيرُ يَلُوذُ وَيَسْتَجِيرُ الْمُجْرِمُ. So who does the wrongdoer turn to? If only people that do good can hope for you. أدعوك ربي كما أمرت تضرعا. I'm calling on you, my Lord, as you commanded me in total humility. فإن رددت يدي فبمن ذا يرحم. And if you turn away from me, who will show mercy to me? That is raja, and that comes from Allah. So ikhlas, when calamities hit you, ikhlas is one of the great gifts. وَإِنْ يَمْسَسْكَ اللَّهُ بِضُرًّا فَلَا كَاشِفَ لَهُ إِلَّا هُ. If harm comes to you, there's nobody that can remove the harm except Him. And knowing that is such a great blessing. And the times you know that is when dur afflicts you, when harm afflicts you. That's when you realize it. There's nobody that can remove it. And then a tadarru' with dua, that prayer, calling on Allah is such a gift from Allah. فَإِذَا مَسَّ الْإِنسَانَ ضُرٌّ دَعَانَا. When harm comes to human beings, they call us. Because how many people forget Allah when there's no trouble? And then when trouble comes, Ya Allah. And that's what it took to be reminded of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that is a blessing. That is a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then al-hilmu amman sadrat anhu al-musiba. Forbearance, learning clemency. Learning clemency. I mean, that's one of the things when afflictions come, compassion comes out of your heart. When you see other people afflicted, it actually causes, when you see people without an arm, that poor person, it moves the heart. It should. If it doesn't, then you're not well. So that is also one of the blessings. Al-afu an janiha, forgiving the one who harmed you. What a gift to forgive the one who harmed you, because kayfa ma tadinu tudan. Just as you treat others, so shall ye be treated. So if you forgive people, on Yawm al-Qiyamah, what do you think the forgiver of wrongs will do? Because if you're always wanting vengeance in this world, then Allah reveals Himself as the avenger of wrongs in the next world, al-Muntaqim. But if you're always forgiving people in this world, Allah reveals Himself as the forgiver. أَنَا عِنْدَ ظَنِّ عَبْدِي بِي. I am as my servant understands me to be. And if you always want vengeance, I mean, one of the things about Muslims that really saddens me is we're always asking for justice for our enemy. And yet, when we talk about ourselves, Allahumma arhamni, Allahumma aghfirli, nobody at Arafah is saying, Allahumma, be just with me. Take me to full account. Give me everything I deserve. Nobody's ever, in 1400 years, I'm almost absolutely certain that nobody has ever made that dua on Arafah. And yet, when it's somebody else, Allahumma intaqim, Allahumma kun adlan fihi, be just with him, be vengeful, and this is really what's going on. Because what does the believer want? لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يحب لأخيه ما يحب لنفسه. No one of you truly believes until he wants for others what he wants for himself. Imam Nawawi said, يشمل اليهودي والنصراني, that includes Jews and Christians and other people. Why don't you want guidance for other people? Forgiveness. If you knew what hell was, you couldn't want hell for anybody. Maybe a moment's taste just to purify all their wrongs, but in reality you couldn't. الصبر عليها, learning patience. إن الله مع الصابرين, Allah is with the patient. صبر جميل, learning patience. It's the first maqam on the path. الفرح بها لأجل فوائدها, being joyful about it because of all the benefits that come from it. Right? I mean, it's a tribulation in Iraq. It's a tribulation that happened, and it's still a tribulation. But also, there were benefits that had to come out of it, because nothing is purely bad in this world. There's always benefits. الشكر عليها, being grateful for it and earning great. تمحيصها للذنوب والخطايا, removing wrong actions. وما أصابكم من مصيبة فبما كسبت أيديكم ويعفو عن كثير. He forgives so much. رحمة أهل البلاء ومساعدتهم على بلواهم. Compassion towards those who have these tribulations, and then helping them, because man nafasa kurbatan min akhihi, whoever helps a brother with a tribulation in this world, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will help him with the tribulation of the next world. Ma'rifatu qadri ni'mat al-afiyah, knowing the blessings of al-afiyah, knowing what well-being, the blessing of well-being, and just knowing what that is. وما أعده الله تعالى على هذه الفوائد من ثواب الآخرة على اختلاف مراتبها, knowing all of the gifts that will come from your patience and from these tribulations in the next world, because the Prophet ﷺ said, ummati ummatun marhuma, my ummah is forgiven and their difficulties are in this world. ما في طيها من الفوائد الخفية, what's hidden in all those, because you don't know what all the blessings that come. How many times in your life, and I know all of you, there's not a human being in this room that can't say this. How many times in your life has something terrible happened to you, and you were so distraught about it when it happened, and then all this good came from it? But it took you a long time to see that or realize that. And so that is also one of the great blessings. And then also, إن المصائب والشدائد تمنع من الشر والبطر والفخر والخيلاء وتكبر وتجبر. So calamities and tribulations prevent you from being arrogant, from being evil, from being boastful, from being filled with ostentatiousness and kibriya, tajabbur, oppressing others. If had Nimrod been a poor man, you see, really, Fir'aun said, "Ana rabbukum al-a'la." Had Fir'aun been a falah in Egypt, or a faluka, the man who takes the people across the Nile, he just would have been probably a nice person, but he owned all of Egypt, and he looked around and he said, "I must be Lord. Look at what I've got." So that's a great blessing in itself. So there also ar-ridha al-mujib li ridwanillah, also the contentment in what Allah tries you with, that brings to you the contentment of Allah with you. Radiyallahu anhum wa radu anhu. They were content with Allah, and Allah was content with them. So that's the highest, because ridha is just a great maqam.
Okay, inshallah, we're going to go ahead and start with the questions and answers. The first one we have here for Imam Hamza: what is the definition of evil in Islamic theology? Does Islamic theology believe that bad things are inherently evil, or are bad things just evil because God so designated?
That's an excellent question. Somebody's probably had a philosophy course, because that's a big issue in philosophy, and it's dealt with in the famous Socratic dialogue known as Euthyphro, where Socrates asks Euthyphro, who's bringing his father to trial for murdering a servant, and he really has ulterior motives, but he asks him about the definition of piety, and then he takes it to this question of, are things good because God has told us to do them, or are they good in and of themselves? And this is very important, because if they're good in and of themselves, then that means that God is held to a standard of goodness. If they are good because God has designated them so, then God is not held to that standard, and therefore we cannot question God. Now, when we say God is good, there are two ways to look at that statement. One is, in philosophy and in Islam, they divide statements into two types, analytic and synthetic. An analytic statement is meaningful in its defined terms. A synthetic statement needs outside evidence. So if we say God is good, the differences that we have about this problem are based on whether or not we view this sentence to be analytical or synthetic. If we view it as analytical, then it means that God is good, and that you don't need any outside evidence for that, because each term is defined within the proposition itself. And therefore, I don't have to have evidence in the world that God is good, because God is good. And then it becomes irrelevant what the world reveals to me, because, like Shakespeare says in Hamlet, nothing is good or evil, but thinking makes it so. In other words, that our understanding of good and evil is always within our thinking. And yet, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us to do certain things and not to do other things. And He has told us clearly that there are things that are shar and there are things that are khayr. We would say that good and evil in the Islamic tradition, according to the Ash'ari, and this is a debate, the Mu'tazilite disagreed with this, but the Ash'ari and the Maturidi, and again, Maturidi is more of a middle position on this, but the traditional position is that nothing is good or evil except because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has deemed it so, and the intellect cannot arrive in its limited understanding of good and evil. And that is why nothing, even though an act in and of itself can be evil, nonetheless, in a larger plan, it could actually be a good act. But the Sharia tells us one thing, and haqiqah is another thing. And we are commanded to judge by the outward, not by the inward. And that is why the Prophet ﷺ said, "Umirtu an ahkum bil-dhawahir." I was commanded to judge by outward appearances. And so outwardly we have to say that's evil. The inward reality of that thing is not our affair. And that is why when we see things, we have to see them with almost bifocular vision. We have to recognize that the Sharia condemns this and I must condemn it. On the other hand, there are wisdoms here that I do not see. Now, the Mu'tazilite obviously said that no, things are evil, good and evil, and those criterion apply to God as well, which means there's something outside of God greater than God, which is good, the summum bonum. Because that in Western philosophy is equated with God according to Kant. Whereas we don't believe that. We say what the Prophet ﷺ said, "Al khayru kulluhu bayna yadayk." All good is in your presence. وَالشَّرُّ لَا يَعُودُ إِلَيْكَ. And evil does not return to you. We believe that evil is a creation of God. And that's why we believe in the qadr khayrihi wa sharrihi, hurwihi wa murrihi. But we do not return that evil to God. In other words, when something good afflicts us, we attribute it to God. If it bad afflicts us, we attribute it to ourselves. Ibrahim a.s. said about Allah, yuhyini, he says that Allah brings me to life and then causes me to die. And then when he said, وَإِذَا مَرَضْتُ فَهُوَ يَشْفِينَ, he didn't say, وَإِذَا يُمْرِضُنِي, and when he makes me ill, he heals me. The ulama say that's ta'adduban, because marad is shar. In the Arabic language, shar is also a marad. So if you get afflicted with a disease, asabahu shar, even though it could be khair, but he attributes it to himself, and then he attributes the healing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. again, there's a lot of aspects to this question, but ultimately evil for us, shar, is anything that Allah has prohibited us to do. That is shar. What He's permitted us to do, that is khair, or commanded us. And then this is important in relation to animals and creational acts, that there is no moral judgment on an animal. If an animal eats you or eats your brother for lunch, you cannot see that animal as evil. Animals cannot be evil. I mean, you can call it shar, but it's not morally evil. You cannot put a moral valence on a ghayr mukallaf's act. If they're not accountable for their actions, there's no moral valence. And that is why we do not attribute evil to children either. I mean, a child can kill another child, but we do not attribute evil to that act because there's no moral valence that can be applied to that. It's shar, but we can't say that it was evil in that way. You might want to add something to that.
Well, I think that this is the ethical question of good and evil is one of the ones that is problematic in Islamic history. And if we look at the fitrah, the natural disposition of human beings, the hadith that pertain to that, the verses that pertain to that, it's one of the central Islamic teachings. And when the rationalists appeared in early Islamic history, the Mu'tazila in particular, they seized upon the fitrah. So that the verse, كُلُّ مَوْلُودٍ يُولَدُ عَلَى الْفِطْرَةِ, every child that is born with a natural disposition. And then the other hadith like that. These are authentic traditions, and they are transmitted virtually in every hadith collection. But because the Mu'tazila focused on that issue, their opponents, and among them the Sunnis, they tended to back off from that. So that if you study the issue of fitrah in hadith commentaries and early Quran commentaries, you'll see that there's all sorts of potential there that the early commentators back off from, sometimes even close off, because they don't want to strengthen the Mu'tazili position. Later on, when the Mu'tazila have passed away and they're only a memory of history, then you see people like Imam al-Ghazali, and after that Shah Waliullah Dahlawi, and other great scholars of the later centuries. They then begin to elaborate on the fitrah. And the Sufis in particular make the fitrah, the natural disposition, absolutely central to their metaphysical teachings. And part of that fitrah is that it knows good and evil. It has intrinsic knowledge of good and evil. So the standard Ash'ari definition, as Imam Hamza pointed out, was that they define good and evil in terms of divine will. So it's the divine volition, that whatever He has commanded us to do is good, whatever He has commanded us not to do is evil. And that is true on a cosmic level, but nevertheless there is a much broader level than that. And I think this has to be taken into account, particularly today when we come to talk about the issue of ethics, which is a really big question. Another thing too is that in the doctrine of acquisition that Imam Hamza talked about for the Ash'aris and the Maturidis in particular, one of the points that was made very clearly in that doctrine is that the moral quality of acts is something that human beings affect. So they would say that acts have two doers. They have a pre-existent doer, the creator, the cosmic will, and then they have a temporal will that attaches to that is also part of the process. The Prophet said, peace be upon him, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, that actions are only to be judged by intentions. So God, as they say, He creates at the instant of your will, not by your will. So when you want to do something, He creates generally what you want. Sometimes He doesn't. Sometimes He does other things. Sometimes you're incapable. Sometimes you want to do something and you can't. This is the reality. But two wills attach to every deed. One of them is pre-existent and cosmic, and it is effective. It is efficacious. The other one is one of volition and will. And it looks in the mirror of deeds as if we are the doers. But actually we give the deed its moral quality. The story of Khidr in Surah Al-Kahf, the chapter of the cave, shows that very well, because Khidr, the teacher of Moses, he does things which are outwardly wrong. But because of his intention and his knowledge of the realities that other people don't know, they are actually the best of deeds. So the moral quality always is a function of what the human being does. And therefore also our scholars distinguish between what they call evil on a particular level and evil on a universal level or cosmic level. In fact, to my knowledge, the standard position of Al-Maturidi and others, Ibn Taymiyyah as well, is that there is no cosmic evil as such, because wisdom dominates the creation. And so therefore, although evil does happen, human beings do terrible things, there are diabolical deeds throughout creation. Nevertheless, in the cosmic scheme, they all pertain to wisdom. And therefore, as Imam Hamza was saying, the presence of evil in the world is also essential to the wisdom of God. By opposites, we know things. We know good from evil. We know light from darkness and darkness from light. We learn about the nature of creation. So it has an epistemological effect. It also purifies us. It's the nature of the test, and so forth.
Thank you.
Good points.
So let's get right into this next question, which hopefully won't require a very long answer, but I think it's very important in light of the ongoing discussion of speech and the uncreatedness of the Quran. Please explain the revelation in the Quran which that deal with current events of the time, or I should say current events of that time at the time of its revelation, against the backdrop of the pre-existence of the revelation, such as Surah Abasa or Surah Al-Lahab, etc.
Obviously, when we talk about the speech of Allah, the Kalam Allah, the Imam al-Maqari says, إنما كلامه القديم ما فيه تأخير ولا تقديم نعم ولا لحن أو إعراب أو كل أو بعض أو اضطراب إذ كله إلى الحدوث انتسب ككون علمه على مكتسبة. That his kalam, the kalam of Allah, is qadim, pre-existent. There is no ta'khir or taqdeem, no syntactical linear structure to the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Na'am, wala lahnun, and there's no lahan, speaking. Wala i'rabu, there's no grammatical nature to the Quran. O kullun, o ba'dun, o ittirabu, there's no separating the Quran or gathering the Quran as one piece like that. Because all of that is created in nature, like his knowledge being acquired. Allah doesn't la yaktasibu ilman. Allah does not acquire his knowledge. That's why we don't call Allah al-arif. It's not a name of God, because ma'rifah is muktasaba, even though there's a hadith, ta'arraf ala Allah fi shidda ya'rafaka fi rakha. I mean, the Prophet ﷺ used that word with Allah, but generally the ulama say that word ma'rifah is muktasab. It's acquired, and ilm is not. Ilm can be pre-existent, which is the knowledge of Allah. And so when we think of the Quran like that, we have to understand that this is a sifa, an attribute of Allah that is pre-existent, and therefore we don't look at it in that way. But we have an adab to the Quran, which is the position of the Sunni scholars, that we do not attribute createdness even to these meanings that we have. But we have an understanding that, I mean, one way of looking at it is I don't like to do this, but it might be useful. One way of looking at it is an idea of archetypes. there's an understanding, that there is no circle in the world, right? That a true circle, which is a 360-degree equidistant from its center, with all these points emanating out to this diameter. And that's why pi is such a mystery too, because it's one of these irrational numbers of a circle. So there's an idea that does not exist in the world, but there is an archetypal in the perfect world. That is, I think, probably one of the easiest ways for me to grasp it, is that when we speak of the Kalam Allah, we're not speaking about these created aspects, but out of an adab and a courtesy to Allah, we do not attribute createdness to these things other than in a teaching format. And maybe Dr. Omar could edify.
Well, this question is an old question. It's one of the questions that was brought up when the issue was first raised. And we mentioned yesterday that one of the reasons why the issue of the nature of divine speech was an issue for Muslims was because of the fact that the divine word is such an essential part of Christian theology and a lot of other theologies. So Muslims had to see where they stood on that issue. And these are dealt with in the traditional theology under the rubric of what is called relations or ta'alluqat. And we didn't talk about that hardly at all because it's one of the abstruse aspects of theology. And if what we talked about yesterday was abstruse for many people, as it was, then ta'alluqat would have been completely out of the window. But ta'alluqat are actually very profound because they deal in a rational way with the relationship between the necessary being, the pre-existent, self-sufficient God, and between temporal reality. They deal with the relationship between the one and the many. And this in all religions is a fundamental theological problem. In fact, most idolatries radiate out of this issue. Human beings, as a matter of consensus, accept the negating attributes of God. That there is the one who is unlike anything, who is pre-existent, who is the cause or the root of existence. But how the world that changes relates to him, that's where the problem comes in. And idolatries usually have different theologies of emanation and intermediaries and demigods, half-gods, other gods, and so forth. In the case of the Quran and the divine speech, and also with regard to power and will, then in the theory of relations, they would say that these attributes have relations that are pre-existent and temporal. And so therefore, the divine speech itself that is pre-existent, that is uncreated, it is something that no one knows but God. It, as Imam Hamza said, it's not sounds, it's not letters, it's not syntax. It is a divine speech which is utterly unique and that reveals at once, without any complexity, all that is known in knowledge. Everything that is known in knowledge. So, Tabbat yada abi lahabin wa tab, it's also there, because that was also divine knowledge. And the most beautiful experience in paradise is to see God. وُجُوهٌ يَوْمَئِذٍ نَاظِرَةٌ إِلَى رَبِّهَا نَاظِرَةٌ. Faces on that day will be filled with light, looking at their Lord. The scholars would say that when they look at their Lord, they disappear. If you were to ask the believer in paradise their name when they look at their Lord, they wouldn't even know their name. It's fana. They are overwhelmed by the essence of God. And it's not sight like we see, but it's sight that God creates in us as a gift. Likewise, to hear the divine speech is the greatest beauty of all. Moses heard the divine speech. The Prophet ﷺ heard the divine speech. When Moses heard the divine speech, he couldn't stand to hear the speech of human beings for what? For days and days. And in paradise, Salamun qawlan min Rabbin Rahim. Peace, a word from a most merciful Lord. In Yasin, one of the secrets of this verse, why if you repeat it, it has a lot of therapeutic effects, is because that's a reference to this pre-existent speech. That is the speech, the perfect speech of God, that when you hear it, it's one of the utter pleasures of paradise. So all of these kind of attributes, they have an efficient relation to the particular thing that they refer to in time, like God's creating this cup in a particular time. And they call that efficient temporal. But before that, it has a sufficient pre-existent relation, which is sort of like speaking about potential. So these are dealt with in the theology, and they're issues that may seem to be abstruse and far-fetched, but actually they hone the mind. They bring the believer to have knowledge of God, and there are so many issues that we deal with in life, metaphysically, psychologically, philosophically, that have to be approached, and they require this kind of sophistication. It's one of the greatnesses of our legacy that it has that heritage.
Now, a couple of factual things. A couple people have asked to clarify the author of The Benefit of Calamities. I think it was Sultan al-Ulama Izz Abdus Salam.
Yeah.
Is it Izz ibn Abdus Salam? Izz ibn Abdus Salam, known who enjoys the title Sultan al-Ulama. And so he's the author of The Benefit of Calamities. Also, somebody asked Imam Hamza if that Abu Nawas poem has been translated and if it's available.
It was translated by Bernard Lewis in he has a little book on Arabic and Persian poetry, and there's two couplets. Okay. They were translated in that. Bernard Lewis.
Could I add that with regard to the concept of evil and also free will, that Imam al-Maturidi, you recall yesterday we talked about al-Tahawi, al-Ash'ari, al-Maturidi. Imam al-Maturidi is very distinctive because of the fact that he was a synthetic thinker. And so therefore he has a comprehensive system of theology. And in his system, the wisdom of God is fundamental, and the fitrah of the human being also. So the way that he treats free will and the way that he treats evil is very profound. And issues like the Mu'tazilis had with evil, that they dealt with under the rubric of justice, divine justice, he puts justice under divine wisdom. So he is really an incredible thinker. For him, evil is one of the major discussions. Imam al-Maturidi uses evil as a proof for the existence of God, as a proof that the world is not pre-existent. He uses evil, he shows the wisdom of it in eschatology, in epistemology, and in other things. All of them are great imams, al-Tahawi, al-Ash'ari, al-Maturidi, but al-Maturidi I think is especially beneficial to us because he's a synthetic thinker.
On that note, I was struggling between which of these two to ask next, and I think that's a great segue into the final question for the Q&A. This is a repetition from last night. Imam Hamza, could you state the 5 arguments, the Aquinas arguments, that are based on Muslim theology as well?
Just the names of them?
Yeah, I suppose just the names, and then maybe a couple, 30 seconds on each one.
The first one is the unmoved mover, which is from Aristotle. And the second was the uncaused cause, which is from the Muslims. Those are both considered cosmological arguments. The third one was the argument from necessity and contingency or possibility, which is also, he borrowed that from the Muslims, and that's a cosmological. And then the third one was an argument from gradation or degrees of quality, the hierarchical argument.
That was the fourth one, right?
The fourth one. He doesn't have an ontological argument. They're teleological, and 3 are cosmological, and 2 are teleological. He argued against the ontological argument. So that's the argument from gradation. It's the hierarchical argument that things move from imperfection to perfection. So you can reason inductively up to God. And that's in the Catholic schema of this perfect hierarchy. And the last one is the argument from design, which is everything has a telos. The telos of a knife is to cut well. The telos of a cup is to hold fluid. Everything has a purpose, or what was called a illa ghaiya, the efficient cause of something, that it has a purpose, or the teleological cause of something. So 3 were cosmological and 2 were teleological.
And these were the arguments put forth by St. Thomas Aquinas.
Well, yeah, the unmoved mover is from Aristotle. That is attributed to Aristotle. The teleological is also Aristotelian. The argument from gradation is his. The argument of the uncaused cause and the argument of the contingency and possibility are both Muslim arguments. They're forms of the Kalam cosmological argument, which he borrowed from the Muslims but did not attribute them to the Muslims. And recently, theologians have kind of accepted that the Muslims did come up with those before St. Thomas Aquinas.
Jazakumullah khair.
What's that? Well, I think they're useful, and they're, Ibn Ata'illah says that he intimates in the Hikam that the real argument is not whether God exists, but whether this exists. He said the onus on us is really to prove the existence of creation, not the Creator. And then the other thing, the Lao Tzu, which is reiterated many times by Muslims, Lao Tzu's famous statement when somebody asked him to prove God exists, he said, "You're asking for a lamp to see daylight." And that, in essence, I think that's been the traditional, certainly the Sufis have always taken that route, that the idea of proving the existence of God is idiotic, because they feel, afillahi shak, fatiru samawati wal ard. Is there any doubt about God, fatiru samawati wal ard, the originator of the heavens and the earth? And that is the cosmological argument, though. I'm right there in the Quran. Is there doubt about God, the originator of the heavens and the earth? So, in essence, that verse is indicating that is the proof. The alam in Arabic is the world. And alam is from fa'al. And fa'al is a ism ala. It's the thing that you use to do something. And like khatam is the seal. It's what you do khatam with. So the alam is the thing that you know. It's the instrument of knowledge. What an instrument in and of itself is for something else. So what is the knowledge that the world was designed to afford us? And according to the Muslims, it's knowledge of God. And so we do believe, in essence, that the cosmological argument, that is really the argument. And that's why the Muslims have always taken that. Now, the only real refutation of the argument, the cosmological argument, is what they call the fallacy of composition, which is that because all the parts have a specific quality, it does not therefore mean that the whole has the same quality. The essence of the cosmological argument is that everything in the world has a cause, therefore the world has a cause. The argument against that is, if you have a group of people, in like 10 people, and they say all of them are married, therefore the group is married. The group has a wife. That's the argument against it. But that is true sometimes, it's not true other times. And the idea of the Muslims is that it's just the intelligence of it. And this is still a major problem. They have not, like Dr. Omar said, the argument by default is the onus is to prove not that God exists, but that He doesn't exist. We say al-muthbit muqaddam ala nafi, that in our usul, the one affirming something is always accepted before the one negating, unless the one negating can bring a definitive proof. So ithbat is over nafi. And it's interesting that Allah begins His creedal formula with nafi, but ends it with ithbat. The point of la ilaha illallah is not la ilaha, it's illallah.
Also, as Imam Hamza was saying yesterday, the fitrah itself, the disposition of human beings, is one of the strongest proofs. Also, the experiences that we have with God are one of the strongest proofs. I remember, though, over a quarter of a century ago at the university, I was a professor at that time, but because my wife was in school, we were living in graduate housing, and there was a woman with her child who was divorced. She had very strong opinions. One of them was atheism, and in one particular occasion she was denying God, and she was expressing her opinions, and her child was playing with her, and he sort of strayed off until he got into the street, and the street had traffic in it and very fast cars, and then she noticed the child in the street, and in a very precarious position. He could be killed. In fact, the car slammed on the brakes and so forth. The child is dead. And what does she do? She said, "Oh my God!" In our hearts there's something that's very profound. And that's also in the Quran. It says, you see, and this is not just saying that God exists. This is istighatha. This is istighatha. This is calling upon God for help. And as the Quran says, that when the disbelievers or the idolaters, the pagans, are in severe constraints, they call upon Him. By the way, the child was saved, because also in the Quran it says, He will answer the prayers of those who call upon Him. Yeah. Al-Muttar. So she called upon Him, Muttar, in great need. And she did it instinctively. And the child was saved. He came out. And then she returned to her arguments.
The word also, I mean, there is an interesting relationship between the word istighatha, which ghawth is the one that you call on when there's no one else to call. And some people have showed the relationship with that and ghawth, which is also God. You know, there's very possible, because obviously the first human language, which, I mean, we believe that the first human language that man spoke, Sayyidina Adam alayhi salam. I mean, there's a difference of whether it was Arabic or Syriac, not the ancient Syriac that we have now, but an earlier Syriac. But I think that correlation with that word, and it's yumkin, mumkin.
Jazakumullahu khairan. And with that, we'll conclude this session. The title of the session, of course, is Vicigerancy, Realities, and Responsibilities. Dr. Omar and Imam Hamza will be speaking in this session. So without further ado, Dr. Omar Farooq Abdullah speaking on vicigerancy, realities, and responsibilities.
Assalamu alaikum. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. اللهم افتح علينا بحكمتك وانشر علينا برحمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. This is the final session. The subject that I'm talking about today is a very big one. It's certainly much bigger than I am. And I will focus mostly on the divine names and then how they relate to the attributes. We, of course, talked about the attributes of God, and mostly what we'll talk about now are the names. And many of the books that deal with attributes, they talk about al-asma'i wal-sifat. They will talk about the names and the attributes. The attributions are abstractions. They are qualities that we perceive. The names are much richer. They are much more complex. And the names always refer to the essence, because the names always refer to Him who is God. And so therefore, when we study the names, we don't study them as abstractions, but we study them as references to Him, names of God, which not only do we contemplate, but also we call upon. And when we call upon Him with His names, then He comes to us. He responds. So that the names are, as it were, an advanced stage. And the teachers, the spiritual teachers who are concerned with self-purification and the inner tradition and the spiritual path, they will often, before one begins on that and begins to mention the names, for example, they will see that that person studies carefully the kind of things that we've been studying, so that you can always refer that to the names, so that you can understand the nature of the being that you are calling upon. One graduates then from the attributions to the names. And it is there that this knowledge becomes very practical, especially from the standpoint of worship. One of the highest forms of worship is dhikr, is the mentioning of the names. وَلَذِكْرُ اللَّهِ أَكْبَرُ. And verily the calling, the making of remembrance of God's name is even greater. As we said before, human beings are created to be receptacles of this knowledge. We are endowed with perfect dispositions that are imbued with the knowledge of God, so that even though speaking of will and power and the different attributes seems to be abstract or obscure or foreign, nevertheless there are strings in your soul that it strikes, because you were created for this knowledge. You were created to know your Lord. You were created to have a personal relationship with Him. And that's why also in the study of theology, it often ends with the introduction to ihsan, to worshiping God as if you saw Him, for although you do not see Him, He sees you. And as we said before, Sufism, the second great tradition of Islamic civilization, was the science of ihsan. It is the science of ihsan. But this knowledge is not meant to be just a mental knowledge, just an intellectual knowledge. It's meant also to be put into practice so that you become a knower of God, a God knower as you were created to be. As it said, there is no knowledge, there is no action without knowledge. So to worship your Lord, you must know Him, just as you must know how to do ablution or how to make the prayer before you can actually do it. Again, not only is it the first step in the knowledge of God to worship Him correctly, but also in the law, that's the first requirement. So that when you study the books of law, of the sacred law, they will say that the first requirement is that you know your Lord, meaning that you know your Lord in terms, traditionally, meaning that you know your Lord in the kind of terms that we have been speaking about. So there is no action without knowledge. Those who act without sufficient knowledge often end up bringing about results very contrary to what they wanted. At the same time, there is no knowledge without action. The reverse is also true. So when one receives this knowledge, when we have this knowledge, then we have to also act on it. And the first way that we act on it is by worshiping our Lord and perfecting that worship and mentioning His names and calling upon Him. As one of the great Sheikhs of Morocco said, Al-Arabi Ad-Darqawi, he said that when a meaning is grasped, when a meaning appears to you for the first time, so that you can understand it and grasp it. Let's say, for example, that we're talking about will, and then you understand it. He said it's like a mountain. So if you take it at that time, which means to take it and to practice it, then you have it. It remains clear. And if you don't, it goes away. And when it comes back perhaps like a cat. And then if you take it, you have it. And if you don't, then it goes away. And when it comes back like a bird. Maybe you can't even get it if you want it. So when one is illuminated with this kind of knowledge, then it's important to put it into practice. And of course, the greatest practice that we do is worship. And other things that we do are also very important. But all of these pertain to this knowledge. This is the highest knowledge. And as Imam Hamza said, one of the cardinal sins was sloth. And the meaning of sloth is spiritual laziness. The primary meaning of it is spiritual laziness, which is apathy, theological apathy, not being concerned about God or one's salvation. So we have to take this knowledge then and work with it. Now, the names allow for the direct personal relationship with the one whose attributions are known. And as I said in the first lecture, the divine names are universal. In Islam,
This session continues on the following CD.